Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying the scent of fire and death. Arthur, the last of the dragon knights, stood in the thick of it, his sword raised high, his once glorious army crumbling around him. His hands were slick with blood, his dragon companion, Verither, breathing heavily beside him, scales cracked and bleeding from the unrelenting attacks of the dark forces. The ground beneath them shook as another wave of enemies, shadowed beasts with fiery eyes, charged toward them. Arthur gritted his teeth, swinging his sword with all the strength left in his tired body. Each swing felt heavier than the last, but he fought on. He had to. Behind him lay the ruins of his kingdom, the last sanctuary of his people, and they were depending on him to hold the line. Verither roared, unleashing a torrent of flame that consumed the nearest attackers, but it was not enough. Arthur could feel it in the pit of his stomach. They were losing. No matter how fiercely he fought, no matter how powerful Verither as flames burned, the dark forces were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. His knights were falling, and the bond between man and dragon, once the strongest force in the realm, was crumbling along with them. In the chaos, Arthur caught a glimpse of a familiar figure among the enemy rank. Thorn, once a brother in arms, a fellow dragon knight, now corrupted by the very darkness they had sworn to fight against. Thorn's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his smile twisted with cruelty as he directed the shadowed beasts against them. "Thorn!" Arthur shouted, his voice hoarse, more from betrayal than from battle. Thorn turned, his dark armor gleaming in the firelight. "Arthur," he said mockingly, his voice echoing across the battlefield, "still clinging to your pathetic ideals. Look around you. Your time is over. The age of dragon knights is done." Arthur Salas, heart pounded with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "You were one of us," he yelled, his sword trembling in his hand. "How could you betray everything we fought for?" Thorn's laughter cut through the air like a blade. "I saw the truth, Arthur. The darkness is inevitable, and only those strong enough to embrace it will survive." Verither snarled, his massive wings flaring as he prepared to launch himself toward Thorn. But Arthur placed a hand on his dragon's flank. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not yet." But in the next moment, Verither let out a deep, pained roar, staggering under the weight of a shadowed creature that had leaped onto his back. Arthur swung his sword, severing the creature's head in one stroke, but it was too late. Verither's breathing was labored, and Arthur could see the light in his dragon's eyes fading. His heart sank. "No," Arthur whispered, kneeling by his fallen companion, Verither, his most loyal friend. The dragon who had fought beside him for years was slipping away. Arthur pressed his forehead against the dragon's snout, feeling the heat of his dying breath. Not like this, but there was no time to mourn. The forces of darkness pressed closer, and Arthur knew he had to retreat or perish alongside his dragon. His eyes locked with Thorn's eyes one last time, hatred burning between them. But Arthur turned away. He couldn't win this battle, not now. As Arthur fled, wounded and broken, the sound of Verither's last breath echoed in his ears, a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. Arthur ran through the twisted forests that marked the border of his once great kingdom, his body aching with every step, his mind consumed by the weight of his failure. His people had fallen, his comrades were dead, his dragon was gone. He was all that remained of the Dragon Knights, and he had nothing left to fight for. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the distant howls of the dark forces still hunting him. He could sense them, always lurking just beyond sight, waiting for him to collapse from exhaustion so they could claim his life. But Arthur was not ready to give up. Not yet. As he stumbled over roots and rocks, his thoughts drifted back to an ancient legend. A story told among the Dragon Knights for centuries, a story of the legendary Dragon Mountain, where the last of the ancient dragons were said to dwell hidden away from the world, waiting for a time when they would be needed once more. Arthur had always dismissed the legend as just that, a story. But now, with nowhere else to turn, he clung to it like a lifeline. If there was even a chance that Dragon Mountain existed, if there was even a possibility that more dragons could be found, then perhaps he could still fight back. Perhaps he could still reclaim what had been lost. But the journey to Dragon Mountain would not be easy. The path was long and treacherous, and Arthur was wounded, both in body and spirit. He needed help. That was when he met her. Mira appeared from the shadows like a ghost, her cloak blending into the darkness of the forest. Arthur, half delirious from exhaustion, almost didn't notice her at first. But when she spoke, her voice was like a bell ringing in the silence, clear and sharp. "You read the Dragon Knight, aren't you?" she said, stepping forward, her eyes gleaming with a strange, almost otherworldly light. Arthur's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though he barely had the strength to lift it. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough and hoarse. "I'm Mira," she said, her lips curving into a small smile, "and I know what you see." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "How could you possibly know that?" Mira took another step closer, her movements graceful and fluid like a dancer. "The dragons have not been forgotten, Arthur. They are waiting for you." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. "Dragon Mountain," he whispered. Mira nodded. "I can take you there, but it will not be an easy journey." Arthur hesitated. He didn't trust her. He didn't trust anyone anymore. But what choice did he have? He was alone, wounded, and lost. If there was even a chance that Mira could lead him to Dragon Mountain, he had to take it. "What's in it for you?" he asked, his voice hardening. "Why help me?" Mira's smile faded, and for the first time, Arthur saw something darker in her eye. "I have my reasons," she said quietly. "Let's just say I owe the dragons a debt." Arthur studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Fine. But if you betray me—" "I want you," Mira interrupted, her voice sharp. "I want to see the darkness fall as much as you do." Arthur didn't fully believe her, but didn't have the luxury of being picky about his ally. He needed to reach Dragon Mountain, and Mira was his only chance. "Lead the way," he said finally, his grip on his sword relaxing. And so they set off together, the Dragon Knight and the mysterious mage, on a journey that would take them to the very heart of legend. Their path was not an easy one. The land itself seemed to fight against them, as if the darkness that had consumed Arthur's kingdom was spreading like a disease, corrupting everything it touched. The once beautiful forests were twisted and gnarled, the rivers poisoned, the sky perpetually darkened by storm clouds. They traveled for days, each step bringing them closer to Dragon Mountain, but also deeper into danger. The forces of darkness were never far behind, and on more than one occasion, Arthur and Mira were forced to fight off shadowed creatures that seemed to materialize out of the very ground. Arthur's strength was slowly returning, though. The weight of his grief still hung over him like a shroud. He spoke little, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Varathor, to the battle he had lost, to the comrades who had died under his command. He wondered if he would ever be able to redeem himself, if he would ever be worthy of the title of Dragon Knight again. Mira, for her part, was a constant enigma. She moved through the darkness with an ease that unnerved Arthur, her knowledge of the land and its dangers far greater than he had expected. She spoke little of her past, but Arthur could sense there was more to her than she was letting on. There was a darkness in her, a shadow that she kept hidden behind her calm exterior. And yet, despite his suspicions, Arthur found himself beginning to trust her. She had saved his life more than once, using her magic to fend off attacks and heal his wound. She had guided him through treacherous terrain, always seeming to know the safest path. And though she was secretive, there was a determination in her eyes that mirrored his own. Arthur and Mira continued their ascent, the air growing colder as they climbed higher toward Dragon Mountain. The jagged peaks loomed ahead, sharp against the dark sky, and the wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it an eerie wail. They moved in silence, now Arthur's thoughts consumed by the task ahead. He could feel the weight of his duty bearing down on him, pulling at his already tired body. The further they climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of his vision, and the ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as though the mountain itself resented their presence. Arthur tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, ready for whatever awaited them at the summit. Mira, as always, walked ahead of him with an unnatural ease. Her cloak billowed in the wind, her face set in a determined expression, though her eyes flickered with something that looked almost like fear. Arthur noticed, but said nothing. Whatever secrets she was keeping, they would have to wait until they reached the dragons. For now, they needed to survive. The path narrowed as they neared the top, the jagged rocks cutting into their hands and feet. Arthur's breath came in ragged gasps, each step a battle against the exhaustion that weighed him down. He could feel his body protesting, the toll of the journey catching up to him. But he pushed on. He'd come too far to turn back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the summit. The wind whipped around them, howling like a beast unleashed from the depths of the earth. But Arthur hardly noticed. His eyes were locked on the sight before him, a massive ancient stone archway carved into the side of the mountain. Beyond it, he could see a vast open expanse, shrouded in mist. "This is it," Mira said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind-dragon mountain. Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. This was what he had come for, what he had risked everything for. The legendary home of the dragons. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he passed through the archway, his eyes scanning the mist for any sign of movement. At first there was nothing, just silence and the swirling fog. But then, as if answering his silent call, a massive figure emerged from the mist. The ancient dragon, scales gleamed like polished obsidian, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. He towered over Arthur, his presence filling the space with a palpable power. Arthur had never seen a dragon like this before. It was larger, older, more powerful than any dragon he had ever known. And in his eyes, Arthur saw the weight of millennia. "You seek the dragons," Etbor rumbled, his voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the very bones of the mountain. But why should the dragons heed the call of a broken knight? Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed what he would say if the dragons questioned his worth. But now, standing before Inner, all his words felt inadequate. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "I am Arthur, the last of the dragon knights," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "I come not for myself, but for the people of my kingdom. The darkness has consumed our lands, and I am all that remains. I seek the strength of the dragons to fight back, to reclaim what was lost." There was a long silence. Arthur could feel its hoarse gaze on him, weighing his words, judging him. For a moment, he feared the dragon would refuse, that he would turn his back on him as so many others had. "You speak of noble intentions," Arthur said, at last, his voice measured. "But I see the doubt in your heart. You carry the weight of failure, and it clouds your judgment. Tell me, Dragon Knight, do you truly believe you are worthy of our aid?" Arthur's hands clenched into fists. He had asked himself that question countless times since the battle, since Varathoran's death. Was he worthy? Could he ever be? "I don't know," Arthur admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I will fight until my last breath. Whether the dragons stand with me or not, I will not give up. I cannot." Aithwar's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, without warning, he reared back, his wings unfurling in a magnificent display, the force of the motion sending gusts of winds sweeping through the mist. The air crackled with energy, and Arthur felt a surge of power, unlike anything he had ever known. "You may yet prove yourself, Dragon Knight,"
Arthur said, his voice booming.
"but first, you must face the trials. Only then will the dragons decide if you are worthy of our strength." Before Arthur could respond, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. He staggered backward, his heart racing as the stone beneath him cracked and split, forming a wide chasm that separated him from Etor. The air grew thick with magic, the very essence of the mountain shifting around him. Mira moved to his side, her eyes wide with alarm. "Arthur, this is no ordinary trial. The mountain itself will test you. You must be prepared for anything." Arthur nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. The first trial came without warning. From the mist, shadowed creatures rose, their bodies twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light. Arthur's hand flew to his sword, the blade singing as he drew it, ready to face whatever the mountain threw at him. The creatures moved quickly, their clawed hands reaching for him, but Arthur was faster. His sword cut through the air, slicing through the nearest creature with ease, but more came, swarming him from all sides. He fought with everything he had, his movements precise and deadly, but the creatures seemed endless, their numbers overwhelming. "Arthur," Mira shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos, "you can fight them all." She was right. He couldn't talk. The creatures were too many, too relentless. For everyone, he cut down. 2 more took its place. His arms ached, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but still, he fought on, refusing to be overwhelmed. Then, from somewhere deep within him, he felt it, a familiar presence, the power of the dragons. It surged through his veins, filling him with a strength he had not felt since Varathoran's death. With a roar of defiance, Arthur raised his sword high, channeling the power into the blade. The sword gleamed with a brilliant light, and with one powerful swing, he unleashed a wave of energy that swept through the creatures, scattering them like leaves in the wind. They dissolved into the mist, their forms melting away as if they had never existed. Arthur stood breathing heavily, his sword still glowing faintly with the power of the dragons. He had passed the first trial, but there were more to come. Adder's voice echoed through the mist, deep and resonant. You have faced the shadows, Dragon Knight, now you must face yourself. Before Arthur could react, the ground shifted again, and a figure stepped from the mist. It was Varathor, or at least it looked like him. The dragon stood before Arthur, his scales gleaming in the dim light, his eyes filled with a cold, accusing glare. Arthur's heart clenched painfully in his chest at the sight. Varathor Hal whispered, his voice breaking. But this was not the dragon he had known. This was a twisted, corrupted version of his old companion, a reflection of the guilt that had haunted Arthur since the day of the battle. You failed me, Arthur, the dragon said, his voice a low, menacing growl. You let me die. Arthur's hands trembled as he gripped his sword. I didn't mean to. I tried to save you. Lies, the dragon spat, his massive wings flaring. You were too weak, too afraid, and because of that, I am dead. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He had always blamed himself for Varathor's death, but hearing the words spoken aloud, even by twisted vision, cut deeper than any sword. But this was the trial. He had to face it. I was weak, Arthur said, his voice shaking. I failed you, but I won. T fail again. The twisted dragon lunged at him, its maw opening wide to unleash a torrent of fire. But Arthur stood his ground. He raised his sword, the blade glowing with the power of the dragons once more, and with a single powerful swing, he struck the vision down. The dragon dissolved into mist, leaving Arthur standing alone in the silence. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he had passed the second trial. Arthur's inner voice rumbled through the air once more, this time filled with a note of approval. You have faced your guilt, Dragon Knight. Now you must face your future. Arthur barely had time to recover before the ground shifted again, and another figure stepped from the mist. This time, it was Thorn. Arthur's heart clenched as he faced the man who had once been his closest friend, now twisted by the darkness. Thorn's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. His lips curled into a cruel smile. You think you can stop me, Arthur, Thorn sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You are nothing without the dragons, and even they cannot save you now. Arthur tightened his grip on his sword, his jaw set in determination. This was the final trial. He could feel it.
I'm not telling you to stop you, Thorn, Arthur said, his voice steady. I just need to do what's right.
Thorn, laughter echoed through the mist, but Arthur didn't waver. He stepped forward, his sword glowing with the power of the dragons, ready to face whatever the mountain had in store for him. And then, with a deafening roar, the final battle began.